Good afternoon and welcome to our San Mateo Arboretum Sunday seminar. Today's presentation, Introduction to Bonsai, Horticulture, Techniques and Art with Addison, and I didn't ask you how to pronounce.
Oh, Galambos.
Galambos, yes. I'm Pat Paquette. I'm a volunteer here at the Arboretum and on the Education Committee. Oh, I guess I'm supposed to be over here. Okay. The program will last approximately 90 minutes and it will be recorded. A few days after the presentation, you will receive a copy of the presentation along with an evaluation form. You also have an evaluation form on your chair. So if you can fill it out today, we prefer that, but if not, you can do it when you get your link. And as far as questions for the people who are here, just raise your hand and you don't have to wait till the end of the presentation. Addison has agreed to take questions as they come up, and Zoom participants can go to the chat icon and put your question in there at any time and we will address those. And a little information about what's going on at the Arboretum. We have our Victorian garden right out here, which is, we've been, the person who works on that has really kind of beefed it up and it looks very nice. We have two demonstration gardens, a sun garden and a shade garden, and we try and stock in our nursery the plants that we have in there. So we also have a beautiful rose garden, which Sue Carter, who's our education committee chair, is responsible for. That's one of her other things that she does. The nursery is open 12 to 3 Saturday and Sunday. So if we're done before 3, you can head over there and see if there's something that you have to buy. All of our gardens are maintained by volunteers. So again, Addison Galambos is our presenter for the day. Addison is a longtime bonsai enthusiast. He's currently serving as vice president of the East Bay Bonsai Society. You can see pictures and videos of his work on Instagram under the moniker Tiny-trees. You probably have that in your
Teeny trees.
Teeny trees. Okay. He's passionate about spreading the joy of bonsai and has been delivering beginning bonsai lectures and workshops multiple times a year, as well as volunteering frequently at the bonsai garden at Lake Merritt. His main teachers have been Kathy Shaner, is that correct? Yep. Sam Tan, Todd Schlafer, yeah. And Andrew Robson.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Addison.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited to be down here. It's a beautiful day as well. So like Pat said, don't hesitate to jump in with questions. We have a great size group to make this really interactive. So it should be a lot of fun today. Before I jump into things, I'd love to just hear, what piqued your interest to come in to the meeting today. You don't have to speak if you don't want to, but I would love to hear just to kind of focus me throughout the presentation so I can dive deeper on like specific things that people are interested in. So if anybody has any questions that they want to make sure that they get answered today, if you want to bring them up now or just mention what brought you in today, I would love to kind of start with that. Make sure I don't forget anything. And I'll write them down. Anyone?
Well, I would like to, as I said, I killed 3 of them. So I'd like to get a quality bonsai that's already established and maintain it. And then maybe be able to jump off to actually doing it.
Makes sense.
Addison, could you repeat the confession?
Oh, sorry. Yes, the question was, essentially the question was, like, how can I get a quality bonsai, as I've killed a few in the past, and I want to start maybe with maintaining them, and then go on to the kind of building them aspect of it. It is a little bit scary. Like I mentioned before, I started by, the first 5 years of me doing bonsai was almost all just keeping trees alive in pots. Only the last like 2 to 3 years have I really gone more deep into the artistic side of it. So you absolutely can do that, and it's an effective way. Like, you need the horticulture, you need the basics,
Right.
keep the tree alive,
Right.
in order to do the art stuff. So makes sense.
And one thing I never do, I right. I didn't know they're not indoors.
Yeah, yeah. We'll talk about some common misconceptions as well. So the audience member, sorry, I don't know your name. Anne mentioned that she didn't know that you can't keep bonsai indoors. So we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. Okay, so indoors. Any other questions from the audience or online that you want to make sure we answer today?
I'd just like to know what type of tree, because any tree, bonsai specific, I mean, can you make it from almost anything?
Great question. So the question was, what type of tree can you use for bonsai? So we'll talk about that.
Do we have to repot them?
The next question was, do we have to repot them? We'll talk about that as well. And when and why. Anything else?
Explain why they cannot be indoors. Because we have health plants indoors.
Yes, that's a great point. Somebody in the audience pointed out, why not indoors? We keep houseplants indoors. And I'll definitely talk specifically about that. All right, anything else? All right, and yeah, I think this is a good kind of list of focus questions, and we'll cover all of these today, and feel free to jump in with other questions as well. So I don't know if we can go ahead and bring up the deck, and then, so in terms of structure today, I plan on presenting for kind of going through this deck, answering questions interactively for maybe 45 minutes. And then the second half of the presentation, I brought some plants and I'll kind of show you how we bonsai-ify them. So hopefully that sounds good to everyone. Great. All right. So bonsai. I guess first you pronounce it bonsai. So bon and sai, not bonsai but bonsai. So that's the proper pronunciation of bonsai. So yeah, like I said, we've already gone through the intro section, but we'll talk about the level of care required indoors versus outdoors and some of the kind of common misconceptions. Then we'll go into the horticultural basics, which I expect a lot of you will be really strong at already, given your close connection with plants. And then we'll talk about the techniques, so more of the kind of artistic side of it, and like how do we take a tree from a nursery plant into something like this? And then I'll also have some pictures where I show like the history of this tree, for example, so you can see how it develops over time. And then we'll talk about, just open floor for questions, things that didn't get answered during the presentation, and then we'll go ahead and do a kind of a small demo on some plants over there. Alrighty. So there's a book by this author, Jack. I actually don't know how to pronounce his last name. Douthit. But the title of the book is The Art of Living Sculptures, and he's referring to bonsai, which really pulls out, I think, the kind of unique thing about bonsai, or what makes it very interesting, is that you're doing art, but you have a living medium, right? So there's not a ton of other, I mean, for sure, there's other art mediums that are similar, but as opposed to like a sculpture made out of stone, where you have to use certain techniques to kind of coax life out of the sculpture. In this instance, we have a living thing already, right? And so our techniques that we use to shape it, and like the design that we end up with for the plant, have to also be in harmony with the plant. And it'll tell you by dying if it doesn't like what you've done, right? So that's what really drew me to bonsai. Was I already had a really strong love of nature and living things and having them around me. And I also wanted something that was like a deep, like the ability to have a lot of technical skill and like hands-on skill in a hobby. So that was kind of what drew me to bonsai. And I think the art of living sculptures is a good way to describe it. This here is a very famous bonsai tree. I just wanted to show you an example of, the highest level of tree, or one of the highest level trees within North America. Here you can see, this is a tree that was collected in nature. So this was living in a mountain somewhere and someone dug it up, and, it has this dead wood on it, where it's showing the age and the struggle that this tree went through in nature. And then it's highlighted by kind of the living the living foliage that has been artfully placed around it to frame the dead wood, right? So this is a very, very like high level tree. And this tree, because it's collected, is probably, 500 plus years old. It's hard to estimate exactly, right? But just saying like this is a very old plant that was taken out of nature. And then not that you have to go steal plants out of the ground to do bonsai. This is just like a nursery plant, for example. But and then it might have been a bonsai for the last 10, 15 years where it's been developed to have like this specific shape, right? But there's a difference between the age of the tree and the age of it as a bonsai, like after it was put into a pot. All right. Oh, I think you need to click on the presentation so I can, there we go, okay. So this image was generated by an image generator. But bonsai means, like bon in Japanese means like tray or container, I believe, and sai means cultivation. So bonsai literally means like tree in a pot. So we were asking about what types of species can bonsai be? And really it can be anything. The main criteria we use is it a woody, like does it have a woody tissue, right? If you try to do it with something like an annual flower, that doesn't really get like a woody tissue on it, it might be difficult, and like, it might die after a year as well, which, we developed bonsai over, years and tens of years, right? So really it's any type of plant that has woody tissue. So there are definitely species that lend themselves better to being bonsai than others, right? Like if you can imagine, there's cultivars of oak trees which have really, really big leaves, right? And so if I try to shrink an oak tree that has a really big leaf down to this size, the leaf may decrease somewhat in size due to like the techniques we do as a bonsai, but it's still going to have pretty large leaves. So if I try to make the oak tree this big and the leaf is the same size, it's not going to look as good as if I chose like a really small leaf variety of oak, for example, right? Juniper, this is a juniper. I actually don't know what specific kind. It might be like a San Jose juniper. Juniper are great to use as bonsai, right? Because they have these really tiny needles and the foliage is very fine often, right? And can make very good bonsai. Japanese maple are really popular as well. The other thing I wanted to mention is that in general, you can't keep bonsai trees indoor unless they're an indoor species, right? So for example, this plant here, the Horticulture afra, right? It's a jade plant. These can be kept indoors. So like if you had a bonsai that was a tropical species, like a ficus or a Horticulture afra or something like that, you can keep them indoors and they'll live, right? But for plants that in nature go through a dormancy period, if you keep them at a steady temperature and inside, a year, it might not die. Multiple years, it doesn't go through that dormancy cycle. The plant just runs and runs and runs, and it never gets that chance to rest, and it'll die. So I very frequently meet with people who have been working on their tree or like have had a tree that they got out of that stand at the side of the road, and they've kept it in their son's bedroom, and it was great the first year and a half, but then 2 years, 3 years in, it's dying and they don't know why. And it's because they've kept the plant indoors. Like there's going to be less sunlight indoors than outdoors unless you have like grow lights over it. And B, it doesn't go through that dormancy period. So hopefully that's helpful. The last thing I wanted to mention here and why I generated this cat, other than I like cats. So this cat's taking care of the tree, but a bonsai tree in terms of care is kind of similar to the amount of care that you need to give for a cat. So, you don't, bonsai isn't like a lightly given gift or it's not, you wouldn't like give somebody a cat for their birthday necessarily, unless they knew it was coming, right? So I like to say a similar thing for bonsai because, I mean, obviously probably ethically less or morally less bad if a plant dies than a cat, but you need to water the tree almost daily, right? We put them in these really shallow containers, and we'll talk about how fast draining the soil mix is. So in the summer, like this plant, for example, in the heat of summer, I might need to water it 2 or 3 times a day. You can mitigate that somewhat to like max 1 time a day or something like that, depending on the size of the tree and the depth of the pot and things like that. But you do need to have as a part of your routine either some kind of automatic watering system, or just that you're going out and checking your garden every day to look for pests as well as to water the plant, right? Otherwise the soil dries up and the tree dies. Now, apart from just the watering is kind of like a maintenance activity. You might actually only do 3 to 6 hours of work on a bonsai a year. So it's an interesting hobby in that like you need a very constant low level of attention, but you can do the like big like pruning and styling type things. Like you do it once a year or maybe once every multiple years, depending on how the tree responds. And then you come back to it the next year, right? You just keep watering it and keep it alive like any other plant. So I actually like that a lot about the hobby though. If I'm not feeling like I want to go, do this really in-depth multi-hour styling process, I just wait until like the interest strikes me again, right? The tree's not gonna die because you let it grow too healthily, so it's fine. Cool. So hopefully that answers was that helpful for talking about like indoors, outdoors, and some of the common misconceptions, what type of plants? Did that answer those questions? Okay.
Edison,
Yes.
is that cat fur on the pot and on the base of the trunk?
It is,
Okay.
yes. This was like a generated image, so it's
not part of the tree.
No. That's not a real, it's not a real plant.
And I have a question for winter,
Yes.
we're gonna freeze.
Yeah, so it's similar to other plants.
Well, the tree.
Sorry, the question is, how do you handle them during winter? In the Bay, our winters are pretty mild, like we're not getting a ton of snow. It's not getting to like -15 or like 15 degrees or something like that. But you do need to protect them somewhat, like a juniper, for example, or something that grows and, it gets snow on it and things like that, right? They'll be fine down to, 15, 10 degrees. So you don't need to do anything if it doesn't get below that.
So they're still just as hardy as a 40-foot tree.
For sure. Yep.
Even though they're in.
Yep. Now, the one thing is like a 40-foot tree, the roots are all in the ground where it's getting heated, right? Versus this, like the temperature of the roots can get a lot colder. Now, yeah, I mean, in the Bay, we really don't have to do anything super special for overwintering. But in Colorado, for example, you might put all of your plants in a cold frame so they don't or you might like mulch around the bottom of the pot, for example, to try to keep it a little warmer. But for us, we don't really have to do too much to overwinter them. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead. Yeah. So usually, well, what we do in bonsai, and actually it might be the next slide. This is a perfect segue. It was Francesca, right? Okay. So in bonsai, we don't typically use a normal kind of very organic potting mix. Usually we use something that's very like an aggregate mix, like stones basically kind of put together. So we use these 3 common components, which is akadama, which is a Japanese clay. We use lava rock and we use pumice. So we make a soil mix that's very, very coarse out of these 3 components. And the benefit to this soil mix is that it's very, very porous. So when I water a plant, there's very minimal water retention in the actual soil. This protects from it getting too waterlogged, right? So even if it's raining every day, like I didn't have to do anything special with my plants. Now, would I probably watered them a little less than they were getting watered? Yes, but none of my plants really like died or suffered from it raining every day outside because the soil mix is really, really porous. And there's also holes in the bottom of the container you can see. So it's very important that we don't let standing water like sit in the pot, because then you will get like a waterlogged root rot situation. So we use this really aggregate soil mix. For younger trees, I'll sometimes use like perlite and potting soil, for example, as I'm like, that's what these are in. It's just like a perlite and potting soil mix. Because these are in development, right? This, like now that it's in a bonsai pot, is with that really coarse mix. The akadama is the water retentive, like clay component, and then the lava and the pumice. Pumice also is pretty water retentive, but the other components are more just like coarse, like don't break down over time. So hopefully that helps with that. Yes.
Is there a particular size to the lava and pumice that you use?
Yeah. The question was, is there a particular size to the lava and pumice that we use? Yes. Yes. There's, I don't know it's like 1/16 to 1/32. I don't know the specific gradations, but typically the smaller the plant or the smaller the pot we're putting it in, the finer grain, this finer size of the soil, and then it'll get larger. Usually we don't do stuff bigger than, like this would be, like for a big plant, like this would be like the normal like particle size for like a very large plant. But yes, yes, usually you use smaller grains for smaller plants.
Question.
Yes.
For the for that soil mix, is it usually that those three types of rock soil, or is it that type, some kind of clay, some kind of?
Yeah, so like lava and pumice you can just get from, American Soil and Stone or what, a garden center, just like agricultural pumice. The question was for the soil mix, like can I expand a little bit on like what the three components are? So lava and pumice, you just find they're just lava, rock, and pumice that you get from a garden center. Akadama is a Japanese clay that is imported. Typically, you wouldn't find akadama at like Lowe's, but you can find akadama in the Bay Area at bonsai specialty nurseries. So most bonsai nurseries will have akadama, or you can buy it online. You don't have to use this soil mix, like things will grow in other mixes, but like sometimes people will replace akadama with pine bark, for example, as like the moisture retentive component. But this is like a very tried and true, like tested mix that works really well. I say here like a 1-1-1 mix, like 1 part akadama, 1 part lava, 1 part pumice. But you can buy like pre-mixed bags, and they might come in like a 2-1-1, or generally the more akadama you have, the more wet it will keep the soil. And some plants like wetter soil, and some plants like drier soil. So you might stray a little bit from this mix at some point, but those three components in an equal mix is like the most common mix in the Bay Area to use. Yes, go ahead.
I purchased a bonsai tree, and it seems like it's probably in some organic material or clay-like material. Do you recommend repotting it immediately into something more porous like this, or waiting until whatever the normal repotting would be?
Yeah, so the question was, if I have purchased a bonsai, this is a great question. If I purchased a bonsai and it looks like the soil isn't good quality, like it's very sandy, or it just looks like a, like potting soil, should I repot it now, or should I, wait until the correct season? You do want to address the soil and get it into a more preferable mix, mainly because it helps it make it easy for you to water. If the soil is like a very, very organic soil mix, it can be tough to know when to water it correctly because it doesn't dry evenly, or it like stays wet a longer time. And so your watering schedule can be more uneven. What's really nice with this really porous mix is you can come out and water it every day during the summer, and you're never going to overwater it, right? It's very, very difficult to overwater. So as long as you're watering it regularly, it's very easy to maintain, whereas it might be more difficult with that other mix. That said, I would probably wait until the correct repotting time, which in the Bay Area is November to February. For like when the tree's dormant. I guess if it's a tropical tree, you could potentially repot it in the summer. But if it's a juniper or any other species that's not a tropical tree, typically you'd repot from December or from November to February.
Really basic question, how do you know that the tree's getting enough water? You mentioned, sometimes in the summer, 2 to 3 times. Is it just based on how fast or how slow the soil dries, or
Yeah.
how do you determine how much water is good?
So the question is, how do I determine how much water is good? I'll just go and I'll do it based on touch and on visual. So I have moss on top of my soil, so I like spread moss spores on the top of it, and then it sprouts. Underneath, there's just that, and you can come see later, there's just that rocky soil. I usually do it based on, you basically always want it to be in a state from I just watered it to it's just a touch dry at the top. So I'll come out and I'll touch the top of the soil, and if it's dry, I'll water it. And then, yeah, I mean, that's typically, and then also you can see it, right? So the soil particles change color as they dry. So it'll go from a really dark brown to a really light kind of beigeish brown. And then whenever I see most of the ones are a light brown, then I'll water it again. So with an organic mix, you could stick a chopstick in and feel a little bit down to see if it's still wet, or touch it with your finger. But if it feels dry, you need to water it. The tree should never be getting top to bottom dry. Only the top, the top quarter inch, and then that's time to water it again.
Never get bone dry.
Yes, never get bone dry. I mean, I guess unless it's a species like a Horticulture afra, a succulent type thing, that's okay with that. But for most species that we use in bonsai, they need to be frequently watered.
Maybe an add-on question: do you just water the soil, or do you water the top down?
I typically, I mean, not all. Some plants like junipers, for example, can. The question was, do you water from the top or do you water from the soil? I don't think it really matters. The one risk if you water, so some plants like junipers can also take in water through their foliage. So you are potentially adding more humidity around the plant if you water in which is fine, which is good. If you water the foliage as well as the soil. But you also have to be careful, because if you're watering the foliage, especially on a deciduous tree, for example, you can promote fungus to grow. So typically I'll just water around the base with a really fine, not a mist, but a rain type watering attachment on my hose. That's very common. So hopefully that's helpful. People sometimes submerge their trees in they get a bucket and they submerge the tree. I've seen people do that, but that's you can just water it with a hose normally. I mean, you don't want to have a jet and blast all the soil off, but kind of a light rain around the base, and then just make sure it waters really thoroughly until water is coming out the bottom. Like I said, you can't really, if you have this soil mix, you can't really overwater it. So when you do water it, you really thoroughly water it. You let it run and run and run and run. You don't have to water it for 5 minutes, but yeah. Hopefully that's helpful. And then the last horticultural basic so we talked about the soil that we put it in, we talked about watering it. I guess there's another horticultural basic, which is make sure it gets the amount of sun that's appropriate for that type of plant. Archana was saying she had a Japanese maple that was in the shade for a year, and she was surprised that it was alive just because she hadn't been, she didn't even know it was there, right? But Japanese maples are fine in the shade. So that ended up being okay for that plant. But if you had a juniper and you didn't give it any sun, right? Or a pine tree, for example, then it would probably be hurting, or it would grow very, very slowly if it had no sun. So bonsai plants are pretty much like their natural equivalents, where if it's a Japanese maple and it usually grows in the shade, then you know, it might only, like, you might give it morning sun, but then the rest of the day it doesn't have any sun. You can absolutely burn the leaves and things like that if you have too much sun. The other piece is, if it's like a pine tree or a juniper, like it can have full day sun, as long as you're watering it, like it doesn't dry out, right? That's the thing to be careful of. You can put it in a little bit less sun if you want to water it less frequently. It'll also grow less quickly too, right? So there's a balance there. The other thing is, yeah, I mean, fertilizer is really important to bonsai. Yes, we stunt the growth of the tree by putting it in a small pot, but we still want it to grow healthily, and we want it to respond well to the kind of pruning that we do. So the main thing for fertilizer, like, you know, there's people that feel very strongly about different types of fertilizers and things like that. Use what works well for you, and just do it. So if you're going to use an organic or an inorganic, like, the most important thing is that you are fertilizing. Like for my young trees, I'll just use something like Osmocote Plus or Miracle Grow, like mix it in water and then water it over the tree. For my more refined trees, I have these little like organic pellets that I put on the soil, and they, like, every time I water it releases more into the soil. So I just use these because they're a little bit easier to meter, right? If I'm watering with it, I'm not 100% sure how much is going in, but with this, I can say, okay, I want 5 pellets because of this, because I want it to grow more slowly, or I can add 10 pellets if I want it to grow more quickly. So, and that's called bio gold, but there's lots. I mean, you could use any kind of fertilizer that makes sense. Cool. And then, you know, usually we fertilize during the growing season. Like, I don't typically put fertilizer on in the winter because the tree's not growing. So. Okay, so now we're going to jump from the horticultural side into the technique side, and it looks like we're doing okay on time. So anything before we jump from horticulture into techniques that you want to chat about? All right. Anything online, or no? It looks like we're good, right?
Yeah.
All right. So yeah, for the first technique I wanted to talk about is repotting, and I think somebody asked about this as well. So, you know, I'll typically get a plant in something like this, and with a super deep, you know, nursery container, and I want it to end up in, you know, an appropriately sized bonsai container, right? So like a clay pot. To do that, I need to cut off some of the roots, and I need to affix the tree into the pot. You can see here on the image, there's some wires, right? So essentially we wire the tree, like we affix it into the pot by running wires over the roots, and then using, like, I do have pliers, using pliers to tighten it. The main reason we do that is because I'm gonna come and I'm gonna like disturb the plant. I'm gonna apply pressure to it as I style it and things like that. And if it's not secure in the container, then all the roots that I am trying to grow are gonna die, right? I'm gonna like break roots and rip it out of the container. So if you look underneath this pot, there should be tie down wires, right? There should be wires running underneath the pot. Hopefully you can see that. And those are the wires that come up underneath through the soil and tie down over the soil. There's a bunch of different ways to, you know, technically do that tie-in, but that is a really, really important part of the repotting process. I mentioned in the bay, we typically repot when the tree goes dormant, so November, December timeframe into February. The optimal time for a lot of species is right before the buds burst in the spring. So like right when those buds start to swell on a maple, you would repot it. And then, yeah, I mean, to go from this to that smaller container, we have to trim back a good amount of the roots to get it into that container, right? And then if I wanted to take this juniper, I mean, this is already a small container, so I wouldn't put it in something smaller. But if I wanted to get it into something smaller, you know, whenever I take it out, I would trim back those roots, and then I would put it in the new container with fresh soil.
If you want to repot that, for a tree that size, would you also trim so the branches, so the weight of it is balanced, or is that?
So usually, so the question was, if I was gonna repot this tree that I just showed, the juniper, would I also trim the branches? Typically, it stresses the tree, obviously, like trees in nature don't get repotted very frequently. So it's stressful to the tree to like have to reacclimatize or add energy back to growing roots and things like that. So I wouldn't, and it's also stressful to cut stuff off of it, right? So typically I wouldn't do both at the same time, especially on like an older tree. I might like repot a tree one year and then the next year I would style it and cut it back, right? For this tree or like a tree that's young, like a nursery tree, whenever I started developing this tree, I repotted it and then I styled it the same year, and it was fine. So if the tree is young and has a lot of vigor, then you can get away with doing more actions to it. But like I last styled this about a year ago, and you can see it's starting to get a little bit unruly, right? Like some things are out of place and things like that. So soon I'll come in and I'll do the second technique we'll talk about, which is wiring. I'll take all the old wire off and then I'll rewire it and prune it back. But I didn't repot it this year because I wanted to keep doing that type of work. Hopefully that makes sense.
How often do you repot?
How often do you repot? For young trees, I mean, it can be like this. I kind of up pot as I'm developing it every year, you know, like put it in a bigger container, like whenever it's root bound. For an older tree, typically what I do is if it can't, there's a few reasons why you repot. One is aesthetically, like maybe I want to put it in a better pot for it. So that I would do, you know, you probably aren't doing that every year, but like that might be your reason to repot that year because you want to get it in a better container. And you might not cut too much roots off, but you're just going to put it into a better container for the tree. Second reason is for like if you think there could be a sickness in the roots, like there's root aphids or something like that, or like the tree isn't doing well, but you can't find any pests on the foliage or any reason why it would be sick, you might repot it then and see if there's root aphids or like some disease under the soil. And then the last reason is because water has stopped percolating through the soil. That's the most common reason. So there isn't like a every year you repot rule. The rule is basically whenever I water it and the water just runs off the top of the soil, like the soil is broken down enough that water can't drain through it, that's when you need to repot. So for this, like that might happen naturally every 2 to 3 years. For an older tree, it might be every 10 years. For a younger tree, it might be every year. So it really depends. But when the tree has replaced all the soil, it's broken down and it's all roots in there, that's when you can't like stick a chopstick through the soil at all, right? Or you can't, or you see that water just rolls off the top, that's when you repot. Cool, so that's repotting. I included a link here to, if you Google Bonsai Tonight, he's a nursery owner in Alameda who's really great, Jonas. He has a picture tutorial on the different wiring techniques for affixing a tree in a pot. So that's a great place to start with like, hey, I've got this, how do I get it in a bonsai pot? Or, you know, come to a workshop or something like that. Cool. The other technique that we do is we use scissors and we cut stuff off. So we prune mainly for two reasons. One is like something might not fit into the structure. So like, let's say for whatever reason, I don't think this branch was important in the design. Oh, sorry, yeah. Yeah, sorry. Is that okay, or,
Yeah.
or the front facing one? Okay. So for whatever reason, if I thought that, you know, this sprig didn't fit in the design anymore, I could prune it off, or like one of these primary branches I could cut off, right? The other thing is we prune to control the growth. So not as relevant for a conifer like this, but with a maple tree, for example, it might put out a really strong flush of growth in the internode, like how long the area is between one set of leaves and the next set of leaves might be really long. So I might let it grow out long, but then cut it back to that first pair so that the second flush of growth is smaller. So those are the two main reasons I would prune. And that, I mean, there's all sorts of pruning methodologies for different types of trees and everything like that. And we'll talk a little bit about how to get started here in a second. So that's pruning. We cut stuff back to keep it looking small. And then the other thing that we do on the artistic side is we wire it. So we take, you know, these different gauges of aluminum or copper wire and we wrap it around the branch and then we place it, right? Like kind of like a marionette or like a puppet. We put things in place and then, you know, we might move something. So like, for example, a really common motif is to take conifers and make them look like, instead of a young tree that all the branches point up like this, we want an old tree where snow has like pulled the branches down. So we'll take that shoulder and we'll wire it and we'll take it from this down to this so that it looks like a tree that you'd see in nature, right? So yeah, and we apply this wire and then we leave the wire on. So for this tree, for example, this wire has been on for a year. Basically, you leave it on until it sets and it starts to bite in. For deciduous trees, you don't want any of that bite in because it'll never go away. So you might only have the aluminum wire on a deciduous tree, like a maple, for 2 to 3 months or something like that, and then cut it off. And then the next year you do it again. So those are the two main techniques we use to do the art side. Is we wire things and then we prune them. Any questions about that? Or obviously these are like very in-depth topics that I'm just trying to give you like an introduction to. But hopefully that makes sense.
Question in this photo image, what
Yes.
is the orange wire? I see what the green wire is doing. What's the orange wire?
Yeah, so the question is in the image that's on the PowerPoint, what is the orange wire doing? So the orange wire here is, I guess, the like primary structural wire. So it's not really doing much in this image because the orange wire would be there to move the trunk. So in this case, it looks like they didn't really do much movement to the trunk, or there was already a lot of movement in the trunk. So the orange wire is just acting as a kind of a brace for the green wires. So like the green wire can touch the orange wire and it gives a little bit more stability as the green wire tries to move the main branches down. But yeah, you're right. In this image, like they might not have needed that orange wire. It's just to demonstrate that sometimes if you wanted to move the main trunk line, you might have to wire the main trunk. And then the green wires are bringing down those primary branches, changing the angle that they have with the trunk. Does that make sense? But yeah, you're right. In this image, the before and the after, the orange didn't look to move too much. But it's hard to move a trunk like that, right? That's as old as the one in that image is. As a young plant, like with this, we're gonna add a piece of structural wire to the main trunk and we're gonna move it. We're gonna try to add some movement. Cool. So yeah, I just wanted to show you some examples before we kind of jump over to the other half of the presentation. So this is a plant that I bought from Home Depot. It was just a boxwood that I found for 25 bucks or something like that. So I wanted to show you like, how can I get started with bonsai today? Or like, what do I think is a good path to get started? So the left picture is it in the nursery container. I bought this in like the December time frame, like when it was good to repot. Because nursery plants are so healthy, typically, or like don't get one that's not healthy, they can sustain a pretty hefty amount of work, right? So the first thing I did to this plant was I pulled it out of the nursery container and I cut off 70% of the roots. So, a nursery container plant like this, I've done this with junipers, boxwoods, olives, like different species. As long as it's healthy and like, looks like it's less than, it's not like 100 years old or something like that. Most nursery plants are going to be, 5 to 15 years old or something like that. So it can handle that level of root work. So I cut off all the roots and then I planted it into a bonsai container. So that was like what I did in December. I bought it and I did that the next day or 2 days later. So this is it, potted up in a bonsai container. And that, I just let it grow for the beginning of the growing season. And then in like July timeframe, I styled it. So the other picture on the side, it's a little tough to see, but I added wired all the branches, I kind of cut it back, and like that was like the starting of the styling. So I'll also show you this one so you can see kind of how it develops over time. But I just wanted you to have an idea of like, this is something that I bought for $25 at a nursery. And then basically with like wire cutters and a pair of shears, you can do that. So it doesn't have to be super expensive to get started in bonsai. You do look a little bit crazy when you're like at Home Depot, you know, like looking up underneath and trying to like see what's at the trunk and stuff like that. Because you want to pick out a trunk that you think is cool, right? Yeah. So so I repotted it in December and then I styled it in July, like after the growth had hardened off for the year. Yes. This is after. So think about it like that's just that part of the roots. This was all cut off.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that all fit in this. This is a training pot, but it's still like it's maybe like a little bit taller than this, but you know, maybe the training pot is like 6 inches or so tall. But I took it from I don't know, 3-gallon container or something like that. That was probably 15 inches or 16 inches down to 4 inches. So I cut probably 75% of the roots off. There might have been a little bit more root that got pruned off between that and this picture, but roughly similar. But I wouldn't cut off more than like 80% of the roots. Like you want to leave some for it to go face off.
Do you
And
leave,
what's the medium in pot? Is it in the same medium you were talking about?
Yeah, so this is a red lava rock, which is why it looks a little redder, but
Okay.
this is lava rock, pumice, and akadama.
Yeah.
If I'm putting it in a bonsai pot, I'll almost always use bonsai soil. So I won't use like potting soil and perlite for bonsai pots.
and how much would you cut off? Is based on depth of the bonsai,
I guess it's based on, so ultimately, yes, like you need to cut off enough roots so that it fits into a bonsai appropriate size container. I could have gotten a deeper container, but I knew that I could cut off 80% of the roots and have it fit in that 4-inch space or whatever. So, like if I was doing this plant, for example, like I absolutely would be taking it back to like, you know, something where it's like looks appropriate. You don't want a super deep container because roots growing down aren't as sustainable for the development of the tree as roots that are going kind of radiating outwards.
do you wire that all, to the pot too, right?
Yes, absolutely. Because I couldn't have done this work in July
Yeah.
if I didn't wire it into the pot in December. Because it would have, you know, just come out. Yeah. And like, even if you're not styling it, if you're interacting with the tree at all, or like wind comes or your cat pokes it, like every time you're doing that and it's not really solidly in the pot, it damages the roots and makes it grow slower or kills it. So it's really, really important to wire it in. Now, like something like this, I didn't wire it in. We'll see if that comes back to bite me today for the demo. But but like whenever you put it in a bonsai pot, it absolutely needs to be wired in. Okay, so this here is this tree. So I bought it in like a nursery container. It looks pretty unruly. Here on this picture right here, I sanded the bark a little bit to make it a little reddish colored. It doesn't look like that right now because the bark grew back, but I could do that again if I wanted like a reddish tone to the bark. And it looked pretty unruly comparative to this, right? There were 2 big branches that stuck upwards. This one and this, So this branch here and this branch here both stuck upwards at like these acute angles. And so I used wire to bend those branches down so that it looked more appropriate for like a tree affected by snow. So bought the tree. I actually styled this one in the container before I repotted it. So July timeframe, this was like my first styling. This was also my first styling that I ever did myself. So it's a little rough looking, but that's where you start. And so this was like the design that I envisioned for the tree. And I used wire to like put the branches in the places that I wanted to. And I pruned it back. So we went from the image on the right to that in maybe, I don't know, 8 to 12 hours. And then, and then when you have the tree today. So later that year in December, I repotted it. And then that was 3 years ago. And then I restyled it last year. And now it's getting close to the point where I need to come and clean it up again because it's starting to get more full and dense, but you know, some of the stuff is grown out of the like manicured pads that I had before. So yeah, that's kind of the development process. Oh, yes.
So you said, before that, you know, you didn't want the branches sticking straight up. Are there other like sort of general stylistic guidelines that people, you know, doing bonsai generally follow?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, I mentioned that there's, you know, you don't want the branches sticking straight up, but are there other kind of style guidelines that we use in bonsai? Absolutely. A lot of them come from like the traditional way to do it in Japan, where there's just these kind of rules that are set. But you know, everybody's free to have their own style. So I actually I wish I had some, now that you mentioned that, I wish I had some pictures of some different kind of styles, but there's some very interesting trees where there's one called Walk Like an Egyptian, where every branch is at a right angle. So it looks very contrived, right? And that might not be your style, but like they made every branch change at a right angle, for example, right? The traditional Japanese approach, at least for conifers, is like have an acute angle between the trunk and the branch. So bring that down so it looks like it's been influenced by snow, and then form a pad by curling out the branches like a hands on a finger. So I kind of have them flat with a little bit of curl up at the tip, and then you form like pads of foliage around the tree. And then there's guidelines like traditionally in Japan, like there's a very triangular form to the out silhouette of the tree. So you can kind of see that in here where I have like triangle, triangle kind of approach. But typically, yeah, the foliage will get closer to the trunk at the top and farther away at the bottom. There's also this concept known as like the defining branch. So the lowest branch on the tree in either direction will be like the directional branch. So like this tree goes to this side because the apex goes that way and the defining branch is on that side going that way, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of those rules. It's a little bit hard to like summarize them all at once, but I like to try to make my trees look naturalistic to some extent, or like an idealized version of nature, where it looks manicured, but could also be something that you kind of stumble onto as you're walking through Yosemite or something like that in the mountain. So there definitely are a lot of rules like that, and there definitely are a lot of rules like that. Yes.
What are very beginner friendly types of, I guess, trees to be used? I'm interested in something indoors that is that can be kept indoors. What do you recommend?
Yeah. So the question is, what are beginner friendly tree types? I actually think I have a slide on. So, how to get started? You too can be a bonsai artist. My recommendation for getting started is one. There's a great exhibit at Lake Merritt. It's a free collection. It's one of the top in the US. So if you're ever in Oakland, you have to check because their hours are kind of weird. It's like only certain days a week and from like 11 to 3 or something like that. But amazing free collection just to go check out. You can also, like, I got started by just starting to volunteer there. I went to the volunteer that day and was like, hey, how can I help? So go check out the exhibit. Another thing that's great is there's tons of bonsai clubs in the Bay Area. So either through the Arboretum with like an interest group amongst yourselves, or there's a club in San Mateo actually called Seiboku, which is a really high quality bonsai club. So join a club, and that's where you can find lots of plant material and people and like workshops that they're giving and things like that. The other way how I got started was I just went to Lowe's or Home Depot or whatever garden, the plant sale here, and I looked for trees that had a trunk thickness that I thought was what I wanted for like my ultimate scale of my tree. And then I bought those and I did what I just showed you. I cut off half the roots and then later in the year I pruned them. That's a very like low cost way to get started. In terms of species that are good, indoor, well, I can give you some of the cuttings that I take off of this today, and you're welcome to use Horticulture afra. But Horticulture afra, jade plant, there's multiple types of jade plant. I think there's like Crassus obala as well, right? But I like this Horticulture afra because the leaves are smaller than Crassus obala, or however you pronounce that. And this cultivar is one that gets like a really corky bark, like a really like textured bark. So this is a good cultivar. The other thing that's really good for indoor is ficus benjamina, or like tiger bark ficus. If you ever seen like a bonsai at Walmart or Costco or something like that, usually it's some kind of like ficus, which they have like a very contrived like S curve kind of look, but it is, you can still, there's nothing wrong with that. So ficus is really good. There's lots of there's a nursery online called Brussels Bonsai that sells like starter plants, tropicals. So they have a lot of different species. But if you want to keep it indoors, you have to have some sunlight or a grow light, and you'd want to get a species that's tropical. If you have an outdoor space, then really common trees to start with are like any kind of juniper. So I just go to the best cultivars are the Japanese Juniperus chinensis. So if you see anything that's Juniperus chinensis, so it'll be like the cultivar will be like Itoigawa or Kishu. Those are two really good juniper species to look for at your garden centers. But you can do like a mounding juniper or anything that looks like it has a cool trunk at the nursery. Most juniper species will work very well. Other thing is like maple trees, so trident maple or Japanese maple are great. Boxwoods, olives are really hardy. So those are all good plants to start with. And then you really don't need a crazy amount of tools to get started with bonsai. You can even use like garden shears. I have these fancy, bonsai scissors, but you absolutely can just use garden shears to cut back the tree, like the pruning step. The other thing I think is kind of necessary is pliers. So, or sorry, not pliers, wire cutters. So I have just this like one from a garden center, but whenever you're doing the wiring step, it's helpful to have some wire snippers to cut the wire instead of using your scissors because it'll blunt them. So, and then of course, once you get more into it, you'll have 3,000 different tools, but that's all I think you really need to get started. So, I mean, you can pick this pair of scissors and wire cutters up for, 20, 30 bucks on Amazon or whatever, or you probably already have them. And then wire, typically folks will buy online. So there's tons of stores online that sell aluminum wire. Copper wire I usually use for for conifers, but aluminum wire is cheaper and works fine too. So you can also use aluminum wire for deciduous and conifers. And then yeah, just get a plant and some soil and have some fun. Does that help? And then yeah, I think that's pretty much think that's pretty much all I have. This is actually like a mall kind of like ficus of some kind. I think so. Yeah, it does look like an IKEA one. So that's how a lot of people get started, and there's nothing wrong with that. Cool. So that was kind of the end of the lecture portion, and just on time. So any yeah, now it's more of like an open question time. So anything that kind of sprung to your mind as you were going through, or we can also get deeper into specific topics if we want to as well. So don't
I
hesitate.
have a reverse question. What if you were to take that tree and put it back in the ground? What would happen?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So the question is, what would happen if you put the tree back in the ground? People do that a lot, actually, as a stage of development of bonsai, because let's say like this whole top part died off and like the style of my tree was ruined, right? I might want to like grow it more quickly. So I'll put it back in the ground and it'll just grow as a normal tree, right? So that's the other thing. If you ever wanted to get out of the hobby and you didn't want to sell your trees, you can just plant them in the ground too. They're just normal trees. They'll grow as normal. It might take like a year for it to really start taking off because it's stress from getting repotted, but they're just regular trees and you're not like changing their physical make or their genetic makeup or anything like that by putting them in a pot. So yeah, it'll revert to a normal tree. And people will do that often as a part of developing them. Even if something doesn't die, they might like put it into a pot to like shape it and then put it back in the ground to like grow it more quickly over time. Francesca?
Yeah, so I just. What are you doing with that?
Oh, this plant here? Yes, yes. So this is what I would call a pre-bonsai. So, this is a cutting that I took 2 years ago. And I put it in a pot and, it's gone from this 6-inch cutting to, something. So what I was going to show today was like the first stage of work that I might do, which would be similar to the first stage of work that you would do if you bought a nursery plant and it was in a container like this. So I put it in this nursery container instead of a bonsai pot because if there's more space, if there's more roots, more space for the tree to grow, it's going to grow bigger faster, right? If I put it in a bonsai pot right away, it's going to grow really, really slow. So this in 2 years, if I had it in a bonsai pot, it could still be only this tall, right? So basically, you don't take the tree out of the ground or out of the nursery container until the trunk is the thickness that you want it to be. The like trunk development, once you put it in a pot like this small one that I have the juniper in, the trunk's not going to get appreciably thicker except in like a 10-year plus timeline. So if I wasn't happy with the trunk thickness, I would not put it in a bonsai pot. So this is in that stage where I wanted to get bigger and thicker. Today, I'm gonna just kind of like show you what I would do to the tree to set future growth up so that, 5 or 2 or 3 years from now, it looks more interesting, right? So I'm gonna show you kind of like that. Hey, this is what I would do to a nursery plant to start developing. Does that make sense?
Addison, I had a question on the fertilization schedule.
Mhm.
Because the medium is so porous, you're watering, you mentioned in summer several times a day. So how often do you fertilize?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, because the media is so porous and you're watering frequently, how often do you fertilize? So originally when I started, I was just fertilizing with what it had on the package. So, water, Miracle Grow, use every 2 weeks, use, that kind of thing. What I've found is, and this is a great question because I didn't find this out until 6 years into my bonsai journey. What I found is that typically the package instructions don't account for exactly the type of growing situation that we have with bonsai, and you'll be under fertilizing to some extent, which isn't going to kill the tree, right? But you're just not getting as much growth out of it as you possibly could. So like Osmocote Plus, these little, I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's it's like a little granule thing. Yes, flow release pellets. Yeah, there we go. I think that says like apply every 6 months. But I find that my pellets are spent after 3 months. So, be careful because you don't want to burn the roots of your plant, right? But typically we do, and that's why I like something like these little organic pellets, because you can kind of see when they're spent and then you just put new ones on. Like they change and break down. But yes, if you're using like Miracle Grow or Osmocote, because we're watering so frequently compared to like if it was in your lawn or something like that, a lot of more of that fertilizer is just kind of going out the bottom of the pot. So you need to fertilize a little bit more frequently, maybe up to as like twice the frequency of the package. But I typically don't do more volume of fertilizer than what's on the package. So like if it says put 1 teaspoon in every 2 weeks, I might do 1 teaspoon in the water every 1 week or something like that.
And I think that really helps to illustrate why you find the pellets so helpful. Then that just removes all this, like, how often should I be fertilizing?
Yeah. And this BioGold fertilizer was made for bonsai, so the instructions are a little bit more appropriate timing wise for bonsai because it's been tested with bonsai. So whereas like Miracle Grow, they probably aren't thinking like, oh, we need to really get those bonsai people the right instructions, So.
Do you do multiple, or have you seen people do multiple species in a pot?
So the question is, have you seen people do multiple species in a pot? Yes, yes. Traditionally in Japan, that's like a big no. Like you have to have the exact same. So you don't see multiple plants in a pot very frequently. There's a few exceptions to that. One is forest plantings. So just like it sounds, instead of having one plant in the pot, you have a wider pot and you'll have a whole forest in there. So you'll have like, usually they do odd numbers. So you'll have 5, 7, 9, 11, 21 seedlings or plants all in one pot. Even with that though, typically the typical guidance is they should all be from the same genetic material so that they're all losing their leaves at the same time, they're all the same color, because that's, I guess, the Japanese aesthetic finds that most pleasing. But there have been some like very famous like anti-culture compositions where it's like they've got a trident maple and a Japanese maple in the same pot, and it's like, whoa, but that's not super common. But absolutely, if that is what, it's not going to die because you have 2 different plants in the pot. So you absolutely can do that if that's, what appeals to your aesthetic.
I have this vague reflection in mind that I've seen a picture of like a bonsai fruit tree. Yes, that.
Yeah, so the question is, are there fruiting bonsai trees? Like we mentioned before, a bonsai can be any type of plant. So absolutely, you can use flowering plants. You could use wisteria, for example. It's a really pretty bonsai. And then you can, an orange tree or an avocado or a lemon can be actually kumquat is very, very popular because the fruits are so tiny. The thing about the fruiting trees though is that the fruit doesn't shrink typically.
Yeah.
So, if you have like an apple tree and the trees, let's say the tree is this big, well, the apple's still going to be an apple size and it can break the branches. So typically we'll take the fruit off. Like we'll showcase the flowers, but we'll cut the fruit off before it grows. The tree also puts a lot of energy into producing fruit, right? And that's energy it's not putting into healing from the cuts that you've done on it, right? So typically we'll kind of like nip them in the bud per se, I guess literally. But yeah, absolutely. And at the bonsai garden at Lake Merritt, we rotate trees from the back into the main collection. And whenever things are flowering or they're fruiting, we'll bring them and put them on display. That's like the peak season to see those things. So yeah, you absolutely can. I wouldn't recommend trying to grow it for volume, like really get a lot of lemons, but absolutely from an aesthetic sense, you can do that. And you might want to pick something with smaller fruit because they won't shrink as much. All right, anything else that sprung up? Any thoughts that going through folks' heads? All right, So we can go ahead and I was just gonna kind of jump into showing like what I would do on this. We can move this tree out of the way here.
How old is that tree?
This one, you know, it's probably like 10 to 12 years old. So, I've had it as a bonsai for 3 years, or like 2.5. But it's not, uh, this was like grown in a nursery, so it's not super old. Like, this wasn't collected from nature. This was grown in a nursery. So I bought 2 of these jade plants because that's what I had in my garden, but we'll talk a little bit about, actually, let me see if I can readjust. I might adjust this a little bit so it looks down. Oh, you're on that one now. Okay, perfect.
You want the other one?
Well, I was gonna point it down a little bit so folks could see on the, because I'm gonna sit, I think, now, so it's a little. So how do I?
Okay, you can tilt it here.
Okay. Okay, does that look? That looks appropriate, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And feel free to, get up and come a little bit closer because it's gonna be kind of small if folks want to, but you're welcome to sit, but if you want to stand on the wings, you're welcome to as well. So, yeah, I've got these 2 Horticulture afras. Oh, sorry. So now I'll talk a little bit about like the aesthetic and like design principles. So usually there's always a front to a bonsai tree. So the first thing I would do is I would look really closely at the base. I mean, these are like, I'm gonna kind of demonstrate the principles, but like it's not gonna be as borne out since these are younger plants. But I would start by looking at the base of the trunk and seeing like, where do I get the most trunk thickness? Like the thick, like tapered trunk base is like a desirable feature. So this is also something that you can use whenever you're looking for nursery material. So the first thing you always want to look at is, what does the base of the tree look like? So, I'll rotate the tree around 360 degrees and look at, like, what are the, like, and I'll reveal a little bit of the base too, so I can see it properly. I'll see like, where is the most interesting base? So you're not going to be able to see that on this, but I'm just showing you like on the video, but I'm just showing you that, I'll rotate the tree around and find like, where do I have the best root flare? The next thing that I'll look at is I'll follow the line of the trunk from the base all the way to the tip of the tree. So I'm looking for an interesting or like an appealing to me design for the trunk line. I can alter it somewhat, but sometimes depending on how big the tree is, right? If it's a 1/2 foot trunk, I'm not going to be able to move that much, right? So I better be happy with whatever angle I choose. So yeah, so those are kind of like what I'm looking at is like, okay, where do I get the best line? Like, where do I get the most movement in the trunk? These are all cuttings, so they're pretty much like very straight. So I'm going to try to add a little bit of movement to them, but that's how you would like pick out a tree if you were trying to pick like which one you wanted to buy, for example, right? So like which one has the nicest root flare, and which one has a good line base to tip. And you also can look at the taper as it goes up the tree. In general, for a natural plant, like it's thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top, right? And we want to see that in our bonsai trees too. So they look like nature in miniature. So yeah, like I said, this is a jade plant, Horticulture afra. These plants are pretty, like you can't, well, I haven't watered this in a like maybe a week because they're easier to bend whenever they don't have a lot of water in their system. They get very turgid, I guess, whenever they have water in them. So this one is fairly bendy for Horticulture afra. Sometimes they'll just like snap in half. So this is a cool species to use for bonsai because of the corking bark on it. But it is kind of like a succulent, so it's maybe not a super traditional bonsai plant. But you can keep them indoors, which is what drew them to me, because I was thinking, okay, I can get this species, and even if I move at some point, and I don't have a backyard or something like that, I can still do bonsai. So yeah, let me put this tree over to the side. So yeah, there's also lots of like design patterns where there's like, okay, there's a formal upright tree where it's denoted by a tree that has a very straight up and down trunk. There's like a slanting styled one. There's there's ones where it hangs out over the edge of the pot, like kind of like this, like a cascading style tree. So there's all sorts of different styles that you can train your bonsai in as like templates. But I would probably assess this tree as well to see like which of these templates do I think appeals to me for this plant. So I'm gonna maybe do something that looks. The first thing that stands out to me is maybe I can do something that looks semi-similar. There's a lot of like trunks coming up from the base of this. So to me, that lends itself maybe towards being more of a deciduous tree, like a oak that you might see on a hill in a field kind of thing, where it's like very like sprawling and spread out and like you've got this big canopy. So that's what I'm gonna try. The first step whenever I'm taking this tree is obviously the tree is like the branches are very far out from the base of the trunk, so it doesn't look proportional, right? The thickness of the trunk to the length of the branches is very off right now, right? So like I know that I'm gonna have to cut this back pretty precipitously to bring it back into proportion and set it up for future growth. My goal, since this is the first styling for this, isn't for it to look like a finished bonsai. Like it's impossible at this stage because it needs to develop those like pads of foliage, those little tufts, those little clouds, right? And those are made over subsequent like cuttings, right? Every time you cut it, it splits into two and then splits into two. So you go from 2 to 4 to 8, and that's how you get that really like dense looking feel. So what I'm going to try to do today is decide on a direction for the tree and then add some movement into the branches. Yeah, so we can go ahead and we can start like cutting back these big like long tufts. And anybody who wants one of these is welcome to, with Horticulture Afra, I'm sure you're familiar. You can just let this dry out for I don't know, 6 days and then just plant it. And this will be a plant, and then you'll have this in 2 years. So anyone's welcome to take one of these home with them. Well, I guess those on Zoom, maybe not, but you'll have to come down. But yeah, anybody who wants a indoor bonsai tree, this can be this is what this was. Actually, this is even bigger than what this was 2 years ago. So that's the other thing with bonsai is you can either you can pay with time or you can pay with money for age, right? So trees have definitely been going up a lot in price recently because there's been a lot more interest in bonsai, which is good and bad because it brings more energy into the hobby and also it's sometimes more difficult for beginners to get started. So that's why I recommend garden centers because Lowe's is still selling junipers for $15, whatever, right? And they can be really good bonsai material. Like that you see over there was a similar plant, right? And then also joining a club. Clubs often have like really like sales for members and things like that where stuff is still affordable. And then for the cuttings, I'm just cutting off the little stuff at the base so that it doesn't get in the way because that's going to be under the soil anyways. So just cleaning up a little bit. But yeah, we can do the cutting stuff later. The problem with bonsai is or just plants in general, you'll end up with like 70,000 cuttings in your backyard and stuff like that. So you got to be a little careful of that. But okay, so I've made some cuts on this, and like this one seems like a good candidate for a cut as well, right? If I want the tree to be like upright, kind of like with this type silhouette here, this is way outside of that silhouette, right? So I'm just making like rough cuts right now to a shape. We might come in and like decide some of these branches aren't needed at all. But right now, I'm just trying to show you like, okay, let's just cut it back and see how this one's very thick, and it's like going pretty far out. So I might actually cut off this entire branch by itself because it's competing. It wants, I could do a style where this would be the main trunk line, but if I'm not going to use it as the main trunk line, I kind of need to cut it off because it's high up on the tree and it's very thick. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna cut this off. Usually when I'm pruning, there's gonna be a little bit of dieback. So if I cut a branch and I cut it like at this knuckle here, then there might be some dieback. So I cut it a little bit above where I want it to end up, right? And then ultimately you'll cut it all the way back to the trunk and you'll add some wound sealant so that it'll heal over flat. But right now, since I don't have any wound sealant with me, I'm just gonna cut a little bit of extra. That was a big chunk there. Okay, so, and I think you can, others might have even more experience with jade plant than I do, but I'm pretty sure like even this thickness, you can root, like they'll root fine, right? You can root pretty thick, yeah. Okay, so I'm starting to get, okay, well, this one you can see also is still kind of outside of my silhouette. So I could use this as like the main trunk line. I could kind of shift the angle of the tree and bring it up like that, or I can use this tree as kind of the main trunk line, and I can cut this back. So I'm gonna cut this back just to like one of the points where it bifurcates, so we get something a little more appropriate. Okay, so I've cut off a decent amount of the foliage here. Now I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna do some of the more like structural edits, so I can see, like, it's still a little difficult to see what's going on here at the base. Typically in like the bottom 1/3 of the tree, you're not gonna have any like foliage or branches, right? In nature, you don't see stuff in trees usually at the very bottom, right? Like the canopy is at the top. So I'm gonna just come in and I'm going to cut off, like there's some little suckers at the base and things like that. Those aren't gonna look proportional as a tree, so I'm gonna cut those off. So come in. And if anybody has any questions while I'm doing this about just anything in general, please feel free to chime in. Because I can clip some stuff in chat too, so. Me personally, so I live in San Francisco and I have a very limited amount of space to do bonsai. I keep them on my, I'm lucky that I have like a back deck area, which has a lot of sunlight, which is good. And it's like protected from the wind. I have maybe 15 to 16 like trees like that. And then I've got maybe 30 or 40 like free bonsai, like this kind of thing. That's kind of my, but I also want to, there's only so much you can like, yes, you only have to do a few hours of work on each tree a year, but a few hours of work times 50 trees and you've got a lot of work to do every year, right? So, you know, you do have to keep your collection manageable. Or you can't like put the art into each tree that you want. Did somebody have a question? Sorry. Oh, okay.
You have cats and bonsai, so you never go on vacation.
Well, we have the cats that are water the bonsai too, so yeah. Just one cat right now, but I wish I added a picture of him in the thing too. So another thing, actually, for gardening, what are the kind of like, if anyone's familiar with like pruning roses, or like what are the rules that you typically use for pruning, like pruning decisions for either roses or like the plants that you would garden with? Does anybody have any?
Open up the interior, crossing branches.
Yeah, there are guidelines one follows, but the guidelines, they're not set in stone.
Yeah. Well, I was just wondering because I'm betting they're going to be very similar to bonsai. So I was going to explain a little bit more about that, but I wanted to hear like, you know, for rose pruning, like, yeah, so crossing branches is a big one, right? Stuff that goes, well, what about stuff that goes like straight up or straight down? Do you often prune those off, or?
Well, you prune for height,
Okay.
size,
Okay.
shape. garden and we do we train the volunteers on rose pruning, so I am interested, but I think the reasons might be a little different,
Hmm,
but aesthetics is a common.
okay. Yeah, I guess it's kind of a little bit hard to see, but there's this branch that's in the interior of the tree and it's crossing over other branches. So that's another, with bonsai, it's the same thing where if a branch crosses another branch, like typically in nature, when you have we're trying to mimic old trees, and old trees, like when a tree is young, everything grows upwards and there might be multiple things coming out of the same place. But with age, you know, they're going to naturally drop some of those competing branches and things like that. Or like one will win its way to the exterior and get all the light, and the other one will be deprioritized. So with bonsai, we want to speed that process up. So instead of letting everything compete, we're going to make those decisions for it, right? So a really big structural pruning concept is you typically don't want 3 branches coming out of the same spot on the trunk or like on a branch, because 3 branches will lead to swelling in that spot. So you can get inverse taper where the bottom of the tree doesn't have that swelling, but the top has the swelling where there's 3 branches coming out or more. And so we'll cut back to just 2, we choose 2 winners, like the trunk and then 1 branch off of it, for example, right? In one like node or one spot. So we do the same thing in bonsai. We also trim stuff that's crossing. I guess not a little bit different than roses. We might wire something to move it if we want to keep it. Or maybe do the same thing. Okay, yeah. So you might, instead of cutting it, you might want to keep it for whatever reason, and you'll just separate it with wire or with a prop or something like
With a
that.
prop, yeah.
Yeah. What else? Typically in bonsai, we cut things that go straight, unless it's the trunk, we cut things that go straight up or straight down. Because if it's going straight down or straight up, it's very likely to cross other branches within the design. Or, you know, the corollary is we wire it, so instead of going up, it's going down, right? Whenever we prune back, also we typically, I don't know if this is similar with roses, but like we'll typically prune back to like the first or second pair of leaves on the branch. And that's so we want the tree to look dense. And for most trees, like for most plants, if you prune them, then they'll send out 2 shoots from that spot, right? And then you can prune those back and then they'll send out 2, right? So if we prune at the very first one, we get the minimal distance from the trunk to the start of the branching, right? And so we want the tree to look really proportionate ultimately. And so the more we can do to make it more dense, like if instead of, like, let's say I'll use this one as an example. So this is a branch, I already cut it off, but let's say this was a branch on the tree. You know, I could cut it back here where I've got like kind of 2 or 3 sets of leaves. But the bifurcation is going to come from here. So I'm never going to recover this distance, you know, into the trunk. So I could actually cut it back further, like to here, for example. And then now or I could even cut it back further, back to this one. So now, like that branch looks a little bit sad right now, but ultimately, like this is going to grow, and then I'll cut that back and that will grow. And I'll end up with a much denser foliage that looks more proportionate. So like this might be what I cut back to because I want that future growth to start from there. Now this has 3 coming out of the same spot, so I've broken my rule. So ultimately I would have to prune one of these out. And so now I just have those 2 coming from the branch. So this would be like good pruning for this species. Jade plant's like very, very vigorous, so like it would be fine with this. Well, this might not be a good cutting anymore, but but yeah, you're right. Yeah, even if just one of the little leaves, right? Yeah, but like that's an example of the level of pruning that we do for these types of plants. Now, don't go and hack back all of your plants where they're unhealthy or something like that, right? But in the growing season, like in spring, we'll come and do, like after the leaves harden off, for most species, we'll come and do this exact thing. Okay, so we're doing okay on time, right?
Yeah, we're kind of, yeah, maybe, yeah,
Oh, okay, yeah, sorry. Oh, yeah, we're done at 2:30, right?
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry. Okay, let me go ahead and finish up then. So I'm gonna move a little bit quicker here.
So would you want to put that in a shell or not? At this point?
Well, so I still wanted to grow and develop, so I still wanted to grow and develop. So like I wanted to get bigger faster. So I could put it in a bonsai pot now if this was the ultimate thickness that I wanted the plant to be. So I absolutely could do that. This is not the ultimate thickness that I want this plant to be though. I do want it to be thicker. So I'm gonna leave it in this terracotta pot, but I'm not gonna put it in a bonsai pot yet. So, okay, so I've taken it down to a little bit more tree-y looking, and now I need to wire some of the branches out to give space for foliage to grow in the center. So I'm just gonna add some structural wire to this. And then I'll probably prune back a little bit more, but that would be the like rough, like at this stage of work, like this is still a few years from becoming like bonsai looking. So this would be the stage of work that I would do today to set it up for future success. Add a little bit of space for plants, for the branches to grow in the interior and like open up the tree to light and like start those bifurcations happening. Cool. So sorry, I realized that we are out of time. So I will go ahead and I'll continue just cleaning this up and adding some wires so folks can see, but definitely don't want to hold anybody after their apportioned time. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
People, if you can, yeah, do your evaluation before you, that would be great.
Yeah, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to connect. I always love talking to folks who are getting interested in bonsai. So happy to give you my number, or you can message me on Instagram at Teeny Trees. Yeah, and hopefully you had a good time today and are interested in bonsai. For some reason, I thought it was till 3. That was my bad. I was like, oh, I've got plenty of time. Yeah. Oh yeah, and feel free to come and take some cuttings if
So
you'd
you
like.
stuck the wire in soil and
Yes.
then started wrapping.
Exactly.
Okay,
So for the trunk, since there's nothing to anchor it to, I just stuck it into the soil.
okay.
But for these 2 branches, I'll wire them together.
You're gonna put those two together?
Yes, yeah. I'm gonna take a piece of wire and I'm gonna wrap it around both of these. So I'll show you how I do that. Yes, yeah. Feel free to take some of that. Yeah.
That might be ready next year.
While he's finishing, I'll just do a wrap up here. As I mentioned, you'll be getting a recording of this, so if you need to read.
Oh, you want to stand by the video?
please do. Bye-bye, thank you. Our next seminar is on May 5th. It'll be edible herbs and flowers with master gardeners Cindy Morris and Kathy Fleming. Thanks so much to Addison and Kevin and Archana for our technical support, and Sue and Francesca, our education committee, and myself. So yeah, thanks again for coming. And if you're interested in volunteering with us, you can go to info@sanmataoarboretum.org. And that's it. Thanks again for coming. And yeah, Addison will.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it was great. So do we have a volunteer to make bonsai? Looks like